Nobody died in Harper's gun shop that Tuesday, and that right there is the strangest part of the whole story. Most tales worth telling end with somebody in the ground. This one ends with a man riding west and a woman setting down a gun she'd carried for 14 years. But if you want to understand why either of those things happened, you need to start the morning after. You need to start with Jesse Crane walking into a dark shop, finding his boss sitting alone in the shadows and counting 5 empty whiskey glasses on the counter. 5 glasses. Not 1, not 2. 5. Jesse stood in the doorway a long moment, letting his eyes adjust. The shop smelled the way it always did. Gun oil, old leather, the faint metallic bite of brass. The clock on the wall ticked steady and indifferent. Morning light slanted through the side window, laying pale strips across the wooden floor. And there sat Harper Dalton in the chair behind the counter, hands flat on the glass surface, staring at nothing in particular. His eyes were red at the edges, not from crying, from not sleeping. "Boss," Jesse said carefully, "you been here all night?" Harper didn't answer right away. His gaze moved slow, like a man waking from something deeper than sleep. "Close the door," he said. Jesse closed it. The bell above jingled once, then went quiet. He looked around the shop more carefully now. The side window had a small crack running from the lower corner, not from a bullet, not from a fist. Just pressure. The kind of mark left when someone leans their forehead against cold glass for a very long time. The floor near the far wall showed scuff marks, the kind left by multiple pairs of boots moving in different directions, and that drawer beneath the counter, the one Harper kept locked, was open, just a few inches. Inside, resting on a square of dark red velvet, lay a Colt .45 revolver. Single action, the grip worn smooth from years of use. Jesse had never seen that gun before. "What happened here yesterday?" he asked. Harper looked at the 5 glasses. Then he looked at Jesse. Then he looked out the window at the empty morning street. "Nothing happened," he said quietly. "That's what I've been sitting here trying to understand. Now, if you want to know what he meant by that, we need to go back. Back to Tuesday morning. Back to about 20 minutes before 10 o'clock, when the light was still new and the street outside was carrying on. The way small western towns do, a wagon rolling past a woman with a basket heading toward the general store, 2 men talking outside the barber shop without much urgency. Ordinary. Unremarkable. The kind of morning you forget by afternoon. Jesse and Tommy Briggs had arrived early that day. Tommy was 22, still learning which end of an opinion to lead with. Jesse was 26 and hadn't learned yet either, though he'd have argued the point. They were restocking shelves, talking the way young men talk when there's nobody around to impress, when the bell above the door rang. Jesse looked up. A woman walked in. She was somewhere in her late 40s, wearing a brown canvas coat that had seen better years. Her boots were dusty from the road. Her hair was pulled back plain and practical, without a single concession to decoration, and down the left side of her face, running from her temple to the line of her jaw, was a scar. Long, clean, the kind left by something with an edge. Jesse's mouth was moving before his brain had time to supervise it. "Look what the wind blew in," he said loud enough for the whole shop to hear. Tommy laughed. He wasn't sure why he laughed. He just did. The woman didn't look at them. That was the first thing. She didn't look at them at all. She looked at the front door, the distance from the entrance to the counter, the angle of the frame. She looked at the side window, the view out to the street, the height from the sill. She looked at the gap where the counter ended and the back room began. She looked at the ceiling briefly, and then at the far corner of the shop where the shadow was deepest. All of this took about 4 seconds. Then she walked slowly and without hesitation toward that far corner. Her boots made soft, even sounds on the floorboards, not the careless tread of someone browsing, not the deliberate stomp of someone making a statement. Just quiet, measured footsteps, like a woman who had spent a long time learning how to move through the world without drawing more attention than necessary. She stopped in the corner, put her back to the wall, and stood there. "You lost, ma'am." Jesse tried again, leaning on the counter with a grin that had worked on him before and would likely work less and less as the years went on. dress shop's 2 doors down." Tommy laughed again, quieter this time. The woman's eyes found Jesse. Just once. The look lasted maybe 2 seconds, pale gray, the color of winter sky before a storm, and in those 2 seconds Jesse felt something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear exactly. It was closer to the feeling you get when you say something out loud and realize a half-second too late that you've said something foolish to someone who already knows it. Tommy stopped laughing first. He would think about that later, about how he'd felt the change in the air before he could explain it. "I'm exactly where I need to be," the woman said. Her voice was quiet and flat with no edge of anger in it, which somehow made it worse. Then she looked away, back toward the door, and she waited. There was a man standing near the rifle cases who had been watching all of this with considerably more attention than he let show. His name was Owen Fletcher. He was 62 years old, built along the lines of someone who had spent the better part of 4 decades outdoors, and he wore the kind of careful stillness that comes not from being relaxed, but from being at all times very much aware of where he was and what was around him. He had ridden with the cavalry for 20 years. He had fought in the border wars. He had tracked men through country that most people wouldn't cross on a good horse with provisions. He had arrived at Harper's shop that morning with no particular intention beyond looking at a rifle he'd been considering. That intention had changed about 30 seconds after the woman walked in. It wasn't the scar, it wasn't the coat or the boots or the way she'd ignored those 2 young men. It was the way she moved through the room. Owen had seen people walk into spaces with that kind of attention before. He had done it himself for 20 years, and he still couldn't always stop doing it even now, a decade after he'd handed in his commission. It was the habit of someone who had spent a long time in places where reading a room wrong could cost you everything. You learned to note the exits without looking like you were noting them. You learned to feel the corners before you settled. You learned to always put your back to something solid. This woman had done all of that in the time it took Jesse to open his mouth. Owen set the Winchester back on the rack. Carefully, without looking like he'd made a decision, though he had. He turned his attention back to the rifle cases, but his eyes drifted to her every few seconds, watching the way she watched the door. Not anxious, not afraid. Something more controlled than either of those things. She was waiting for something, or someone. And whatever it was, she had been waiting a long time already. Jesse was still going. "So, what are you here for, then?" "We don't have much in the way of—" "I'm waiting," the woman said. "Just that." Jesse blinked, tried to find the angle. "Waiting for what?" She didn't answer. The clock ticked. Outside, someone called to someone else down the street. A dog barked twice and stopped. Ordinary Tuesday morning sounds carrying through the glass like they belonged to a different world. Owen watched the woman's right hand drift slow as smoke to rest along the edge of her coat, not reaching for anything, not threatening, just present, aware of what was there if it was needed. He recognized that too. He looked at her face again. The scar, the gray eyes moving at measured intervals from the front door to the window to the door again. And then something in his memory stirred. Not a name, not a face from a wanted poster or a newspaper article. Something older than that. A story told around a campfire in Wyoming territory 7 or 8 years back. A name mentioned in quiet tones by a cavalry captain who didn't use quiet tones for much. A description of a woman who had done something that most men would not have managed, and that none of them entirely believed until they'd seen the proof themselves. Owen Fletcher went very still. He looked at the woman in the corner with entirely different eyes, and then softly, without moving toward her or giving any indication to the 2 young men that anything had changed, he thought, "Lord Almighty, that's her." The bell above the door rang at 7 minutes before 10. Everyone looked up. Harper Dalton stepped inside. He was 58 years old, broad through the shoulders, with hair gone mostly to iron gray, and the kind of weathered face that comes from years of working near doors that open onto hard country. He had a small metal box tucked under one arm, a delivery he'd collected from the freight office that morning. His boots were clean. His expression as he crossed the threshold was the ordinary expression of a man arriving at a place he'd arrived at 10,000 times before. He took 2 steps into his shop and stopped. His eyes found the woman in the corner. The metal box shifted in his grip. Not much, just enough to tilt, just enough for anyone paying attention to notice that something had hit Harper Dalton hard and fast, and from a direction he had not been expecting. His face went very still, not the stillness of surprise, but the stillness of recognition. The kind that comes weighted, the kind that carries years attached to it. Jesse had been watching Harper looking for a cue. He saw his boss's face and felt the skin on the back of his neck prickle. Tommy saw it too. He put down the box of ammunition he'd been restocking. Owen did not move, but something in his posture had changed a degree of attention that made the air around him feel different, like a hound that has caught a scent. Harper stood still for another 2 seconds. Then he set the metal box down on the nearest surface, and his right hand went briefly to his coat pocket, just a touch, just like a man reassuring himself that something was still there. He looked at Jesse. His voice came out quiet. "Boys," he said. Jesse waited. "Get out." Jesse blinked. "What?" "Outside. Both of you." Harper's eyes had not left the woman in the corner. "Now. Boss, we're just now." The word came out flat and final, and it had in it something that Jesse had never heard from Harper before. Not anger, not impatience, something that sounded like a man who had once given orders that other men followed without asking why, and who had not forgotten how. Tommy was already moving. He went past Jesse toward the door without a word, his eyes wide. Jesse stood another moment, his face flushing, wanting to argue, wanting to understand, finding neither option available. He turned and walked to the door, and as he pushed through it, the bell rang, and the morning air hit him outside, and he stood on the wooden sidewalk with Tommy beside him, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Inside the shop, Harper walked to the door and turned the lock. Not loudly, not with ceremony, just quietly, the way you close something that needs to stay closed. He turned back to the room. Owen Fletcher had not moved from his position near the rifle cases. He stood with the particular quality of stillness that Harper, in 20 years of knowing the old cavalry scout as a customer and occasional friend, had never quite been able to read. Owen was watching Eliza. Eliza was watching the front door. Harper crossed to the counter, stood behind it, hands resting flat on the glass. He looked at the woman in the corner for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket. He took out a small piece of wood, dark with age and handling the size of a large coin worn smooth at the edges. A piece of wheel spoke from a Conestoga wagon. He set it on the counter between them. Didn't say anything, just placed it there where she could see it. The woman's eyes moved to the piece of wood. She looked at it for a long time. When she looked up, something had shifted in her face, small, careful, but there. "I didn't know you still had that," she said. "I didn't know why I kept it," Harper said, "until right now." Owen's gaze moved between the two of them. He did not know the full story yet, but he knew enough of it. He had known enough of it from the moment this woman had walked through the door, and the knowing had been sitting in his chest like a stone since then. He took a breath. "Ma'am," he said quietly enough that it would not carry beyond the walls of the shop. The woman looked at him. "I know who you are," Owen said. The woman looked at him for a moment with those pale gray eyes. She did not confirm it. She did not deny it. She looked at him the way someone looks at a person who has just said an obvious thing in a situation where obvious things don't require a response. Then she looked back at the front door. Owen Fletcher nodded once, slowly, to no one in particular. He walked to the door, unlocked it, stepped out onto the sidewalk. The bell rang. Fresh air moved through the shop in his wake, carrying the smell of dust and morning, and the distant sound of the town going about its unremarkable Tuesday. The door closed. The bell went quiet. And inside Harper's gun shop, with the clock ticking on the wall and the pale morning light cutting across the floor in clean angles, two people stood in the kind of silence that does not need filling. Harper looked at the piece of wood on the counter, looked at the woman. "How long?" he said. She checked the small pocket watch she pulled from inside her coat, looked at the face of it, put it back. "Maybe an hour," she said. "Maybe less." Harper closed his eyes briefly. The way a man closes his eyes when he has been hoping for news he always knew was coming, and it has come, and hoping was never going to change it. When he opened them again, the woman was watching the door, and somewhere at the far end of the street, quiet under the ordinary sounds of Tuesday morning, the day was moving toward noon. Outside on the wooden sidewalk, Jesse Crane leaned against the wall of the shop with his arms crossed and his jaw set, trying to look like a man who had been asked to step outside for a perfectly reasonable reason and was perfectly fine with it. Tommy stood beside him, not pretending. Further down near the post at the corner, Owen Fletcher had taken up a position that gave him a clear view of both the shop door and the length of the street leading in from the east. He was not looking at Jesse or Tommy. He was looking east. Jesse noticed. "Who is she?" he said mostly to himself. Owen didn't answer. His eyes were still on the eastern end of the street. "Hey!" Jesse pushed off the wall. "Old man, I'm talking to you. Who is that woman?" Owen turned his head and looked at Jesse the way you look at someone who has asked a question they're not quite ready for the answer to. "You'll find out," he said. "Give it an hour." He turned back to the street. Jesse looked at Tommy. Tommy looked at Jesse. Neither of them had anything useful to say. The clock inside the shop ticked on. The town went about its business, and at the eastern end of the main street, the road stretched empty and quiet in the morning light, leading out into the wide, indifferent country beyond, waiting like everything else for what was coming. Harper let Jesse and Tommy back in at 10:30. He opened the door, looked at them both standing on the sidewalk. Jesse with his arms still crossed, Tommy with his hands in his pockets, and said simply, "Come inside." Then he turned and walked back to the counter without waiting to see if they followed. They followed. Owen came in behind them uninvited, and no one asked him to leave. He moved to the window on the far side of the shop, the one with the view down the eastern length of the street, and stood there with his back half turned to the room, watching the road, the posture of a man keeping watch, which is exactly what it was. The woman was still in her corner. She had not moved from that position in the better part of an hour, and yet she did not look like a woman who had been standing still. She looked like a woman who had been doing something important that happened to require no visible movement. Jesse looked at her, then at Harper, then at the small piece of dark wood sitting on the glass counter between them. "Who is she?" he said. Harper was quiet for a moment. He picked up the piece of wood, turned it once in his fingers, and set it back down. "Her name is Eliza Drummond," he said. The name sat in the air of the shop without doing much at first. It was just a name. Jesse waited for more. 14 years ago. Harper said her husband was killed, him and 9 other men in a camp raid up in Montana Territory. The men who did it were called the McCrae brothers. 6 of them. Tommy had gone still behind the counter. "The McCrae gang," he said quietly. "I've heard that name." "Most people have," Harper said. "They ran cattle raids from Wyoming to Montana for the better part of 15 years. Left a trail behind them that took years to fully account for." He paused. "After the raid that killed her husband, Mrs. Drummond tracked them, all 6 of them, across 3 territories, over 18 months. Jesse opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. One woman, against 6 men, against 6 men. Harper looked at him evenly. "She brought them all back dead." The clock ticked. Outside a wagon passed. Normal sounds carrying into the shop from a world that had no idea what was being said inside it. Jesse looked at the woman in the corner. Really looked at her past the scar, past the worn coat and dusty boots, trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he was seeing. A woman in her late 40s standing quietly against a wall. "That's not possible," he said, but his voice had already lost the certainty that would have made the words mean something. "It's possible," Harper said, "because she's standing right there." Owen turned from the window. "You want to know how I know she's who she is?" He looked at Jesse with the particular patience of a man who has watched a great deal of the world and learned not to be surprised by how little of it most people have seen. I rode with the cavalry for 20 years, fought in the border wars, chased men through country that would kill you just by being in it long enough." He paused. "In 1879, the Army sent 3 companies after the McCrae brothers. I led one of them. We tracked those men for 2 months through the Bitterroot Mountains." Tommy leaned forward slightly. "Did you catch them?" Something moved through Owen's face. Not regret exactly. Something older and more settled than regret. The kind of feeling a man has had long enough that it's become part of the furniture of who he is. "No," he said. "We found them. 2 days before the first snow came down. I knew where they were. I could have given the order to move that night." He stopped. "My commanding officer wanted to wait for a second company. I disagreed, but I didn't have the rank to override him. 2 days later the snow came. They were gone." The shop was very quiet. "The McCrae brothers went on for another 2 years after that," Owen said. "They hit the Drummond camp in the spring of 1881. His eyes moved to Eliza, not accusing, not seeking absolution, just acknowledging. "If I'd done what I knew was right in 79, things might have gone differently. I've carried that for a long time." Eliza had been looking at the door. She turned now and looked at Owen. "You couldn't have known what 2 more years would bring," she said. "No," Owen said. "But I knew what the right call was, and I didn't make it." "Neither did I," Eliza said quietly. "For a long time after. The difference is, I eventually made one." Owen looked at her for a moment, and something passed between them the way something passes between people who have both carried weight they couldn't put down and understand each other across the fact of it without needing to explain it. He reached into his coat pocket, took out a small folded paper, a page torn from a field notebook. He wrote something on it with a stub of pencil, a few lines quickly, and set it on the counter beside Harper's piece of wheel spoke. "If anyone ever asks where this story really started," he said, "it started there, that night in the Bitterroots, not in that camp in Montana." No one argued with him. It was Harper who finally said what needed saying. He looked at Jesse and Tommy, both of them standing behind the counter with the particular expression of young men who have just learned something that doesn't fit any of the shapes they've been using to understand the world. "You want to know how I know her," he said. "Not just her name. How I know her personally." Jesse nodded. Harper was quiet for a moment. His hand rested near the piece of wood on the counter without touching it. "Winter of 1888, he said. "I was a lieutenant in the Army Corps of Engineers. We were moving a supply convoy through the Montana territories. 12 wagons, 50 men, equipment worth more than most of us would earn in a lifetime." He moved out from behind the counter and walked slowly toward the center of the shop as if the story needed room. "We hit a mountain pass in the middle of a blizzard. First wagon lost a wheel, second one wedged between 2 outcroppings of rock. Horses started going down in the cold. My commander started pushing harder, shouting, ordering the men to force it through. The harder we pushed, the worse it got." He paused. Night was coming down. Temperature was still dropping. We were looking at losing men before morning. Tommy had forgotten entirely that he was supposed to be restocking shelves. "And then a woman rode in out of the snow," Harper said. "Alone. No introduction, no request for permission. She just arrived, looked at the situation for about 2 minutes, and started giving instructions, not to the officers, to the men." "They listened?" Jesse asked. "I listened," Harper said, "because I'd seen enough stuck wagons to know when someone understood the physics of the problem better than the pride of the solution." He almost smiled at something private. "She had us redistribute the weight across 3 wagons instead of 2, change the angle of the lead team, used 2 of the supply ropes as bracing on the second wagon's axle. Things that sound simple when you say them out loud, but that none of us had thought of because we were too busy trying to force what wasn't working." He stopped walking, stood in the center of the shop. "It took 6 hours. We lost 2 horses and 1 wagon to the cold, but every man came out of that pass alive, all 50 of them." He looked at Eliza. "Including me." The shop was very still. "When we came out the other side," Harper continued, "she was gone. No name, no goodbye, nothing. Just gone back into the weather the way she'd come out of it." "When did you find out who she was?" Tommy asked. 3 years later. I'd mustered out by then and come back here to run my father's shop. One day a woman walked in asking for a specific model of Colt revolver custom grip longer barrel than standard. I recognized her voice before I recognized her face. He paused. I asked if she'd been in Montana in the winter of '88. She said yes. I asked if she'd helped a stuck Army convoy out of a mountain pass. She said yes. And then I asked her name. He picked up the piece of wood from the counter, turned it in his hands. When she said Drummond, I already knew. Everyone in the territories knew that name by then. He set the wood back down. I asked her what she needed. She said she just wanted to live quietly, said the past was finished. From the corner, Eliza said without turning her head, "It wasn't." "No," Harper said softly. "It wasn't." Jesse had been thinking about something since Owen had spoken, and he finally let it out. "You said she tracked all 6 brothers," he said. "So where does this come from?" He gestured vaguely in the direction of the street outside, the direction of whatever it was they were all waiting for. Eliza answered before Harper could. "Nobody knew about the 7th, she said. Her voice was even the way the voice of someone is even when they have said a hard thing so many times in the privacy of their own thoughts that saying it aloud has lost the power to shake them. He was born 2 years after the others. Different mother. She left his father before the boy was born and raised him under a different name. The brothers never knew he existed. "Then how did he find out about you?" Tommy asked. "Letters." Eliza's eyes stayed on the door. When his brothers started dying, lawyers contacted the family. He got 6 letters over 18 months, each one saying the same thing. A pause. After the 6th one, he started looking into it. Spent 2 years learning everything about his brothers, about what they'd done, about what had been done to them. "And about you," Owen said. "And about me." Jesse was quiet for a moment. Then, "How did you find out he existed?" "Rumors at first, stories that didn't quite add up, a name mentioned in the wrong place at the wrong time." She touched the scar on her face briefly without seeming to realize she was doing it. 3 weeks ago I tracked those rumors to Cheyenne, found a man working as a clerk in a land office living under a different name. I walked up to him on the street, told him who I was, told him why I'd come." The shop was so quiet that the clock sounded loud. "He was faster than I expected," Eliza said. "He could have killed me. He chose not to." Her fingers dropped from the scar. "He told me to meet him here, at noon today, at the shop where I bought the gun I used on his brothers. He said he wanted me to remember everything before he finished it." Tommy's voice came out very young. "And you came." Eliza looked at him then. The look was not unkind. "I've been running for 3 weeks," she said. "I'm done running." At 20 minutes to 11, Eliza reached inside her coat and took out her gun for the first time. Nobody flinched, but everybody noticed. It was the Colt .45 that Harper had sold her 15 years ago. The grip was worn smooth from use. The barrel carried a patina that spoke of careful maintenance over a long time. She did not point it at anything. She did not check the cylinder or count the rounds. She simply took out a small piece of soft leather from her coat pocket and began slowly and quietly to work it along the length of the grip. Jesse watched this for a moment, then leaned over to Tommy and said very quietly, "What is she doing?" Tommy watched her hands, the deliberate, gentle movement of the leather against the worn wood. "I think," Tommy said, equally quiet, "she's saying goodbye to it." Jesse looked at him, then back at Eliza. The way she moved the leather was not the motion of someone preparing a weapon for use. It was something else. The motion of someone tending carefully to a thing they had carried a very long time and were preparing finally to set down. Harper behind the counter saw it too. He turned away and pressed his hands flat on the glass surface and looked at nothing for a moment. Owen at the window had gone very still. The clock read 11:45. It was Tommy who broke the silence, and he did it with the kind of question that only someone young enough to still ask it directly would ask. "Mrs. Drummond," he said, "are you scared?" Eliza considered this. She kept working the leather along the grip unhurried. "The first time I did something like this," she said, "I was terrified. My hands shook for a day and a half afterward, and I couldn't eat, and I lay in the dark for most of a night, just listening to my own heartbeat to make sure it was still there." She folded the leather and put it back in her pocket. "After the third time, my hands didn't shake anymore." A pause. "I thought that meant I was getting stronger. It took me a long time to understand it meant something else." "What did it mean?" Tommy asked. Eliza looked at him. Her face was not hard. It was honest in the way that things worn down to their essential nature are honest. "It meant I was becoming something I never intended to be," she said. "Something useful for one purpose and not much else." She holstered the gun, adjusted the set of her coat. "Am I scared today?" She looked at the door. "I'm tired. There's a difference. Tired feels a lot like scared from the inside, but it points somewhere different." Jesse had been listening to all of this from his position behind the counter, and there was something happening in his face that was uncomfortable to watch, the particular expression of a young man encountering evidence that the world is considerably more complicated than he has been treating it, and finding he has no prepared response for that. He opened his mouth, closed it. Then, "Ma'am, what I said when you walked in." He stopped, tried again. "I was wrong. About everything. I'm sorry." Eliza looked at him. The gray eyes measured something and apparently found it acceptable. "You were young," she said. "That's different. I'm old enough to know better." "Then you've learned something today," she said. "That's the best any of us can do." Jesse nodded. He didn't look entirely satisfied with that, which was probably correct. Some lessons are supposed to leave a mark. At 11:50, Deputy Clay Morgan walked past the front window. He walked the way Morgan always walked, steady, unhurried, the pace of a man doing a job he'd been doing long enough to know that rushing rarely helped and often hurt. He was looking straight ahead, the way a man looks when he is very carefully not looking at something specific. Eliza's eyes tracked him from the moment he appeared in the window frame to the moment he disappeared around the corner. She said nothing. Harper behind the counter said nothing. Owen at the side window watched Morgan's reflection move across the glass and said nothing. But Tommy, who was 22 and had not yet learned to read the silences of rooms the way the others had looked between them all, and said, "What was that?" "Nothing," Harper said. Tommy started to push it. Jesse put a hand on his arm and shook his head once, and Tommy let it go. But he kept thinking about the way all three of the others had gone just slightly more still when Morgan passed. The way Eliza's hand had dropped not to her gun, but close, and then returned to its resting position. The way Owen had shifted his weight by an inch one direction, like a man making a small adjustment in response to a small new threat. He filed it away. He was 22, but he was not stupid. The clock ticked, 11:55. Harper went behind the counter and brought out the shotgun from beneath it, set it on the glass surface, didn't say anything about it. Eliza looked at the shotgun, then at Harper. "You don't need to do that," she said. "I know," Harper said. "Harper, I know." He said again, and his voice was not loud, but it was finished in the way that some things are finished. "You saved my life and 49 other men's lives in a blizzard in the Montana territories, and I have been trying to figure out for 14 years what I owe you for that. You keep telling me I don't owe you anything, and you may be right." He rested his hand on the shotgun. "But I'm keeping this here." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face, guarded and composed for the better part of the morning, moved slightly, the way something moves when it has been held in place a very long time and finds unexpectedly a reason to ease. "All right," she said. Owen had left the window and moved to the back wall of the shop, where he had a clear sight line to the door without being immediately visible to someone entering. He checked his pistol, returned it to his belt. Jesse and Tommy, without being asked, moved behind the counter. Jesse picked up one of the rifles from the rack. Tommy followed. Their hands were not entirely steady, their eyes were. Eliza looked at all four of them. "If he comes in shooting," she said, "do what you have to do. If he doesn't, stay out of it." This is between him and me. Understood. Nobody argued. Understood, she said again. 4 nods, reluctant, but real. Eliza turned back to the door. 11:58. The street outside was empty. Not the empty of an ordinary Tuesday morning when people are simply elsewhere doing their business. This was a different kind of empty, the kind that settles over a place when something in the air has changed, some quality of pressure, some shift in the light, and people feel it in their feet and their bones and find reasons to be somewhere else without knowing exactly why. The clock ticked. 11:59. And then from the far end of the eastern street, so faint at first, it might have been mistaken for the wind moving over packed dirt, the sound of hoofbeats. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. The pace of a man who knows exactly where he is going and has been looking forward to arriving. Eliza's right hand dropped to her side, not drawing, not gripping, just resting with the ease of long habit near the worn wooden handle of the Colt. Harper's fingers settled around the stock of the shotgun. Owen went completely still. Jesse took a breath and held it. Tommy did not breathe at all. The hoofbeats came closer, and then they stopped. The door handle turned. It moved slowly the way a door handle moves when the person on the other side has no interest in surprise. The latch disengaged with a small, clean click. The door swung inward, and a man stepped through it into the cool interior of Harper's gun shop, bringing with him the smell of road dust and dry autumn grass and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to someone who has been a long time in his own company. He was tall and lean, dressed in black from collar to boot, except for a silver buckle at his belt that caught the midday light. His hat was dark, pulled low, and beneath the brim his eyes were visible, pale brown, almost amber clear, and unhurried. He looked to be in his late 30s. His face was clean-shaven and unlined in the way of a man who has not been troubled by doubt for some time. His hands hanging loose at his sides were steady in the manner of hands that have practiced being steady. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The bell above it gave one small sound and fell quiet. He did not draw his gun. He did not rush. He stood just inside the doorway and let his eyes move around the room the way a man does when he has thought about a room for a very long time and is now checking it against what he imagined. Harper behind the counter with the shotgun resting under his palm, Owen at the back wall, one hand loose near his belt, Jesse and Tommy low behind the counter, rifles in hand, and Eliza, standing in the center of the shop in the open, her right hand at her side. The man's gaze moved through all of them in about 4 seconds. Then it settled on Eliza, and it stayed there, and a slow and genuine smile crossed his face. Not the smile of cruelty, not performance, something almost like relief. "Hello, Eliza," he said. His voice was soft, the kind of voice that would have sounded pleasant under other circumstances. "Colton," she said. He reached up with one hand and removed his hat, set it on the shelf beside the door with the careful courtesy of a man arriving somewhere he intends to stay a while. Then he took 2 steps further into the shop and stopped, his eyes still on her. "You're punctual," he said. "I appreciate that." "You told me noon," she said. "It's noon." "So it is." He looked around the shop again, taking it in slowly. His gaze moved over the rifle cases, the display counters, the clock on the wall. He was doing what Eliza had done 2 hours earlier, reading the room. But where her reading had been tactical, urgent, the reading of someone who needed to know every exit and angle his was something different, slower, more like a man looking at a place he has thought about for a long time and wants to see clearly before whatever comes next makes seeing clearly harder. "This is a good shop," he said. "It hasn't changed much." The words fell into the room and scattered. Eliza went very still. Not the composed stillness she had been carrying all morning, something sharper than that. Harper's eyes moved to her face. Colton was looking at the rifle cases. The long guns are still on the left wall, clock still above the register. He turned to look at the far corner, the corner where Eliza had stood for 2 hours that morning, and that corner there still catches the shadow until about 2 in the afternoon. The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had come before it. "You've been here," Eliza said. It was not a question. 2 years ago, Colton said. He looked at her without apology. About a month. You were in this town. I was in this town. And you left without doing anything. He was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved to the shelf beside the door to his hat sitting there, then back to her. I saw you, he said. 3 days after I arrived. You were at the corral behind your cabin giving your horse an apple. You'd cut it into pieces first, gave them one at a time. He paused. The horse's name is Birch. You'd named her after the trees along the creek on your property. I watched you do this for 4 evenings in a row. Not a sound in the shop. And I couldn't do it, Colton said simply. I had come here knowing what I intended. I had spent 2 years preparing for it, and I stood there watching a woman feed her horse apples in the evening light, and I could not make the thing I was watching match the thing I had come to do. His voice stayed level. So I left, went back, spent another 6 months trying to understand why. Then I came back. Eliza looked at him for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was quiet and careful, the way you handle something that could go either way. You gave me the scar, she said. I did. In Cheyenne 3 weeks ago. You could have killed me then. Yes. But you didn't. No. He met her eyes directly. I wanted you to have time. I wanted you to come here to this place where you bought the gun you used on my brothers, and I wanted you to have time to think about all of it. Every part of it. A pause. And I wanted to look at you again. In a room. Properly. Before anything else happened. Jesse had not breathed for most of this. He breathed now carefully, trying not to make a sound. Owen at the back wall had not moved a fraction, but his eyes had shifted. The calculation in them had changed. He was no longer watching for a draw. He was watching something else. Harper spoke first. His voice was controlled, but there was an edge in it. The edge of a man who has been holding a particular feeling in place for a long time and is running low on the strength to keep holding. You don't have to do this, he said. Colton glanced at him. I know you, he said. You're Harper Dalton. The convoy in Montana, winter of '88. Harper said nothing. She saved your life, Colton said. 50 men if the records are right. He looked around the shop again. That's why you're still here. That's why all of you are still here. His eyes moved over Owen, Jesse, Tommy. She leaves people standing, everywhere she goes. My brothers left the opposite. He said it without heat, without pride, just as observation. I've thought about that for 2 years. Then you know she's not your enemy, Harper said. She killed 6 members of my family. They killed 10 people first. I know that. Colton's voice did not rise. I know exactly what they did and when and to whom. I spent 2 years learning it. I am not here because I think my brothers were good men. Something moved in his face, a complexity, a weight that didn't fit the smooth composure of the rest of him. I am here because they were mine, and because that means something, even when the people themselves don't. Owen cleared his throat. Everyone looked at him. He stepped away from the back wall, unhurried, deliberate, and moved a few feet into the room. Not toward Colton, not toward Eliza, just into the space. Son, he said, I was part of the unit that tracked your brothers in 1879. Bitterroot Mountains. We had them located. I knew where they were. He paused and let the weight of what he was about to say settle in his own chest before releasing it. I had a commanding officer who wanted to wait for additional support. I disagreed, but I deferred to his judgment, and 2 days later a blizzard came and your brothers were gone. Colton looked at him. If I had acted on what I knew was right, Owen said, your brothers would have been taken that winter. 10 people who died after that night would be alive. And you, he stopped. Let it sit. You would have lived a different life. The room was entirely still. I'm not telling you this to excuse anything, Owen said. I'm telling you because you deserve to know where the chain started. It didn't start with her. He nodded toward Eliza. It started with a decision in a mountain pass in the snow in 1879. Mine. He took a small folded paper from his coat pocket. walked to the counter and placed it down beside Harper's piece of wood. The date, the location, the names of the men involved, all of it. He stepped back. That's the record. You can do with it what you want. Colton stood looking at the paper for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, a shift small but real, like the first movement of a door that has been closed a very long time. He looked at Eliza. She was watching him. Her face was not triumphant. It was not satisfied. It was the face of someone who has been waiting a long time for a conversation that had been inevitable and is now simply in it. "I want to ask you something," Colton said. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and took out a photograph. Small edges worn. He looked at it for a moment with an expression that did not belong on the same face that had walked through the door 60 seconds ago. Something unguarded in it, something that had not been prepared. Then he set it on the shelf beside his hat. A woman's face, young, caught mid-smile. Nobody asked who it was. Nobody needed to. "Her name is Mary," he said. "We were together for 3 years. I was going to ask her to marry me." He did not look at the photograph again. "When the letters started coming, when I found out about my brothers, started learning about them, she said I was choosing dead men over living ones. Said if I went through with what I was planning, she wouldn't be there when I came back." He looked at Eliza. "She was right," he said, "about all of it, and I went anyway." Eliza said nothing. "I want to ask you," Colton said, "whether it was worth it, what you did. Not whether it was right. I'm not asking you to justify yourself. I'm asking whether it gave you what you needed, whether it closed the thing it was supposed to close." The shop was completely quiet. Even the clock seemed to soften. Eliza was still for a long moment. When she answered, the evenness of her voice was still there, but something beneath it had shifted. Something that had been held very carefully for a very long time was being held a little less tightly now. "No," she said. "It didn't close anything." Colton waited. "The first time, the first man I found, I thought afterward that I would feel something different, that the world would feel different. I stood in a field in the evening light and waited for it." She paused. "The world felt exactly the same. The only thing that was different was me." "Different how?" Jesse asked. He hadn't meant to speak. The question came out of him before he could stop it. Eliza looked at him, not unkindly. "My hands stopped shaking," she said. "After the third time they stopped shaking permanently. I thought that meant I had become stronger." She touched the scar on her face briefly. "It meant I had become something that didn't shake. And the things that don't shake are not always the things worth becoming." She looked back at Colton. "It didn't close anything," she said again. "It just made the open place larger, because I had to become a certain kind of person to do it, and that person is harder to live with than the grief was." Colton absorbed this without moving. "But you kept going," he said, "through all 6 of them." "I kept a promise," she said. "To who?" "To my husband, the night they buried him." "What did you promise?" Eliza looked at him steadily. "I promised that they would not get away with it." "And they didn't." "And they didn't." Her voice was quiet. "The promise is kept. That's the problem with promises made to the dead. Once they're kept, you discover that the keeping of them doesn't bring the person back. It only brings you to the end of the road you built with nowhere left to walk." The photograph on the shelf caught the light. Colton looked at it for a long moment. What happened next came without warning, which was precisely how Colton had intended it. He looked away from the photograph and looked at Harper. Then he began to walk toward him. Slowly, deliberately, with the settled purpose of a man who has thought about a specific movement for a long time. He did not reach for his gun. He simply walked until he was close enough that the intention was unmistakable, close enough that the distance between them had become a statement. Harper did not move. His hand rested on the shotgun, but he did not raise it. Behind the counter, Jesse's knuckles went white on the rifle. "You're the reason she's still alive," Colton said to Harper. His voice was entirely level. Not just in '88. Today. You gave her a place to come back to, people willing to stand with her. He tilted his head slightly. I've been thinking about that, whether it changes things. Step back, Owen said from across the room. In a moment. Colton kept his eyes on Harper. If she had no one left, if she'd spent 14 years alone and arrived here today with nothing on her side, would she have come at all? Or would she have run? Or would she have simply stopped somewhere along the way because there was nothing worth arriving for? Harper said nothing. His eyes were steady. She builds people, Colton said. Wherever she goes. It's the strangest thing I've ever studied. My brothers left damage everywhere they touched. She leaves. He stopped, seemed to find the word he was looking for. She leaves people who are taller than they were. He turned from Harper, stepped back, not under pressure on his own time in his own direction. Eliza moved, one step smooth and unhurried, into the space between Colton and Harper. Colton stopped. They were close now, close enough to speak without raising their voices, close enough that the room felt smaller around them. The man who taught me to shoot, Eliza said quietly. The Pinkerton agent in Denver. His name was William Caldwell. Colton's eyes narrowed slightly. In 1862 he was part of a gang that raided settler camps along the Kansas trails, she said. 7 people died. He went to prison for 10 years. When he came out, he became a Pinkerton detective and spent the rest of his life working to put men like his former self behind bars. I know who Caldwell was, Colton said. I know you do. I know that's the card you were saving. She looked at him without wavering. He told me everything on the first day, before he agreed to teach me. He sat across from me in a hotel room in Denver and laid out every detail of what he'd done and what it had cost him. And then he said, I'll teach you everything I know. Because I know how these men think. Because I used to be one. And because I need it to mean something that I changed. Colton said nothing. He was 61 years old, Eliza said. He had spent 30 years being a different person than the one who rode into those camps. And he chose to help me because he believed that people could become something other than the worst thing they'd ever done. She held Colton's gaze. I am standing here telling you this because I want you to understand that I am not asking you to forget your brothers. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that you are not required to be defined by them. The clock marked a moment. Colton's eyes moved to the photograph on the shelf. You came here 2 years ago, Eliza said, and you watched me feed my horse apples in the evening, and you could not do what you came to do. You've been telling yourself it was hesitation, that you weren't ready. She paused. What if it wasn't that? What if some part of you already knew 2 years ago that this was not the life you were supposed to build? The stillness in the room had changed quality. It was no longer the stillness of waiting for violence. It was the stillness of something else, something that required more patience than violence and more courage. Colton stood looking at her for a long time. His hands were at his sides. His breathing had changed slower, deeper, the rhythm of a man doing something hard in the interior of himself, where no one can see the effort. Jessie behind the counter was watching this with the expression of someone who had walked into a church expecting a courtroom and found that the trial was already over and he had missed the verdict. Tommy was not watching Colton or Eliza. He was watching Owen. And Owen was watching Colton with an expression that Tommy would carry with him for the rest of his life without ever being entirely able to describe something between sorrow and recognition and a kind of tired, hard-won hope. My brothers did not know I existed, Colton said. He was not speaking to Eliza now particularly. He was speaking the way a man speaks when he is finally, after a long time, saying something out loud that he has only ever said inside himself. My mother made sure of that. She left before I was born, changed our name, raised me in a town in Colorado where the name McCrae meant nothing. Nobody spoke. She died when I was 24, heart trouble. He paused. The letters from the lawyers started coming when I was 27, and the thing I felt... He stopped again. looked at the floor for a moment. The thing I felt was not grief. I hadn't lost anything I'd ever had. The thing I felt was that I had been robbed of the chance to know them, to decide for myself what kind of men they were, to make a choice about whether they were mine or not. He looked up. "You took that from me," he said. The words were direct without performance. "Whatever they were, whatever they'd done, you took the choice away before I ever had it." "Yes," Eliza said. The simplicity of it seemed to reach him in a way that argument would not have. "I know," she said. "I knew when I tracked the last one down. I knew there might be others' family I didn't know about, people who would receive letters the way you received yours." She looked at him without flinching. "I did it anyway. Because the alternative was letting them go, and I could not do that. But I knew the cost. I knew what it would make me, and I knew what it might create further along." A pause. "You are what it created, and I am sorry for that, not for stopping them, not for any of the 6, but for the fact that you are standing here carrying something that was put on you before you had any say in the matter." Colton was still for a very long time. Outside, the street remained empty. The sun was high and the shadows were small, and the ordinary world was going about its ordinary business on the other side of the glass, entirely unaware that something was being decided in this room that would determine the shapes of several lives going forward. Colton reached over to the shelf and picked up his hat. He held it in both hands without putting it on, looked at it. "I have spent 2 years becoming something," he said slowly, "and I do not know what is left of me if I am not that thing." "I know," Eliza said. "I have spent 14 years with the same problem." He looked at her. "The only answer I've found," she said, "is that you start with small things, ordinary things. You feed the horse. You make a meal. You talk to someone without calculating what they know and what they don't. You do it badly at first, because you've been something else for so long that being ordinary feels like a foreign language." She paused. "And then slowly, if you're patient with yourself, it starts to feel like coming home to a place you'd almost forgotten existed." Colton looked at the photograph on the shelf. "There's a woman in Colorado," he said. "She was right about everything, and I owe her an apology that may or may not be welcome." "You won't know until you make it," Eliza said. He stood there a moment longer. Then he put his hat on. He put his hat on, and the room held its breath. It was the small ceremony of it that struck Jesse later when he tried to describe the moment to people who hadn't been there. Not a dramatic gesture, not a speech, not the kind of thing you'd expect to mark the turn of something important. Just a man picking up his hat and putting it on his head. The same hat he'd taken off when he came in, set on the shelf beside the door with the careful courtesy of someone who intended to stay a while. Now he was putting it back on, and everyone in the room understood without a word being said what that meant. Colton turned toward the door. He moved the way he'd moved since he arrived, unhurried, deliberate, the pace of a man who had decided something and was acting on the decision without needing to perform it for an audience. He took 2 steps. Then he stopped. He was looking at the photograph on the shelf, the one he'd placed there 30 minutes ago. The worn edges the young woman caught mid-smile. He reached out and picked it up, looked at it for a moment, not long, just enough. Then he put it in his breast pocket close against his chest and adjusted his coat over it. Tommy would think about that later, the deliberateness of where the photograph went. Not a jacket pocket, not a saddlebag, the breast pocket, the inside one. Colton turned back toward the door, reached for the handle. "Colton." He stopped, looked back at Eliza. She was standing in the center of the shop in the open space she had claimed 2 hours ago and held without retreat. The midday light came through the front window and caught the gray in her eyes and the clean line of the scar along her jaw, and she looked in that moment like someone who had been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and had just in the last few minutes found a way to shift the weight. "The man who taught me to shoot," she said. "William Caldwell. He told me something on the last day of training. He said the hardest part of becoming someone better is not the becoming. It's forgiving yourself for who you had to be in order to survive long enough to try." Colton stood with his hand on the door handle. "I don't know if that applies to you," Eliza said. I don't know what you'll make of this day or what comes after it. But I know that you stood in a room full of people who had every reason to shoot you, and you chose to talk instead of draw. And I know that you came here 2 years ago and watched me feed my horse and couldn't do what you'd come to do." She paused. "Something in you has been trying to choose differently for a long time. Don't waste it." Colton was quiet. "Take care of yourself," he said finally. His voice was the quietest it had been all morning. "Whatever that looks like for you now." "You too," she said. He opened the door. The bell rang. The afternoon air moved into the shop warm and dry, carrying the smell of dust and the distant sound of the town resuming its normal business. He stepped through. The door closed behind him. The bell gave its small sound and went still. And then it was just the five of them standing in the weighted silence of a room where something enormous had almost happened and hadn't, which is its own kind of enormous. Nobody moved for the space of about 10 seconds. Then Jesse set his rifle down on the counter with a sound that was louder than he intended, and the noise of it broke the spell, and everyone seemed to remember how to breathe at approximately the same moment. Harper was the first to speak. "Is he going?" Owen said. He had moved to the window during the last exchange and was watching the street. "He's walking to his horse, taking his time." A pause. "Mounted up, moving east." Another pause. "He's not looking back." Tommy let out a long, slow breath. It was the breath of someone who had been holding it for longer than they'd realized and was only now discovering the full extent of what they'd been carrying. Jesse sat down on the stool behind the counter. Just sat down without ceremony because his legs had apparently decided they were done with the morning and weren't accepting further arguments. "That really just happened," he said. "Not quite a question." "It happened," Tommy said. "He came here to kill her and he just walked out." "He did." Jesse rubbed his face with both hands. "I need a minute." Harper went to the back shelf where he kept a bottle of whiskey for occasions that warranted it. He set it on the counter. Then he took down 5 glasses, 4 from the shelf and 1 from beneath the counter where it had been left from a previous closing time, and filled them with the unhurried generosity of a man who has just survived something and wants to mark the survival properly. He handed them out. Eliza last. She looked at the glass for a moment, then at Harper. "You kept the piece of wood," she said. "I told you. Didn't know why until today. And now—" Harper considered this. He turned his own glass slowly in his hands without drinking from it yet. "I think I kept it," he said, "because it was proof that something real had happened, that one person could show up in exactly the right place at exactly the right time and change how a thing went. And I think I kept it because I needed to remember that was possible." He looked at her. Days when the shop was slow and the world felt small and ordinary, I'd sometimes take that piece of wood out and turn it in my fingers and remember that a woman I didn't know rode out of a blizzard and saved 50 men because she happened to look at a stuck convoy and know what to do. He set the glass down. That kind of thing should be remembered. Eliza looked at the piece of wood on the counter. She did not pick it up. "Raise your glasses," Owen said. They did. "To the people who showed up," Owen said simply. They drank. The whiskey was good. The kind of warmth it put in the chest was the specific, irreplaceable warmth of being alive at a moment when you were aware of being alive, which is rarer than it sounds. Jesse set his glass down and looked at Eliza with an expression that had shed entirely and without residue every trace of what he'd been wearing when she walked in that morning. "Ma'am," he said, "I have a question and you don't have to answer it." "Ask," she said. When he was talking, when he was saying all of that about his brothers, about the 2 years he spent preparing. Jesse paused, looking for the words. "Did any part of you want to, did it ever feel like you might draw on him?" Eliza said. "Yeah." She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about most things without rushing toward a comfortable answer. 3 times, she said. When he walked in, when he walked toward Harper, and when he said that I'd taken something from him he'd never had. She paused. But wanting to draw and being right to draw are two different things. I've been confusing them for 14 years. Today I tried not to." Jesse nodded slowly. He looked down at the counter, then back up. "How do you know the difference?" he said. "In the moment. How do you know which one it is?" Eliza looked at him for a long moment. "You ask yourself who you're doing it for," she said. "If the answer is someone who's still living, someone whose life gets better because of what you're about to do, then maybe it's right. If the answer is someone who's already gone, or something that's already over, or some part of yourself that just wants the pain to stop," she stopped, "then it's not right. It's just easier." Jesse sat with that. Tommy, leaning against the counter with his own glass, said, "Is that how you knew? With him? With Colton?" Eliza looked toward the window, though there was nothing to see now. He'd been gone for several minutes. "I knew because he came here carrying the same thing I carried for 14 years, and I recognized it. Grief turned outward, grief made into purpose, because purpose hurts less than grief and gives you somewhere to walk." She turned her glass in her hands. "I could not shoot the mirror of myself." The clock marked the half hour, 1:30. Deputy Clay Morgan came through the door at 20 minutes past 2. He came in the way Morgan always came in, with the unhurried authority of a man who has been doing a job long enough to know that the job mostly consists of reading rooms correctly and asking questions whose answers he already suspects. He looked around the shop, taking the inventory of it with professional eyes that had been doing this for better than 20 years. He looked at the scuff marks on the floor. He looked at the small crack in the side window. He looked at Harper and Owen and Jesse and Tommy, and then at the space where Eliza Drummond was, not because she had left 40 minutes ago. He looked at the piece of dark wood on the counter, and at the small folded paper beside it. He did not touch either of them. "Harper," he said. "Morgan. Heard there was some activity here around noon." "Slow morning," Harper said. "Picked up a little toward lunch. Back to normal now." Morgan walked the length of the counter slowly, not touching anything. He looked at the open drawer beneath the register, the drawer with the red velvet now empty. "Window's cracked," he said. "Wind shifted funny. Caught me off guard." "Funny wind." Morgan looked at the window. "Don't recall much wind today. Comes and goes." Morgan turned from the window and faced Harper directly. He was not a man who wasted expressions, and the one he wore now was the particular expression of a law officer who knows precisely what is happening and is in the process of deciding what, if anything, to do about it. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He removed a piece of paper, folded once. He set it on the counter between himself and Harper and smoothed it flat with one hand. It was a wanted notice. The paper was yellowed at the edges, the type slightly faded, not ancient but not recent either. At the top, the formal heading of the territorial court. Below it, a name, a description, a list of charges. Eliza Drummond. Female, approximately 35 years of age. Wanted for unlawful killing, Montana Territory. Issued by the Office of Sheriff Daniel Crane, Custer County. Dated March 1885. Harper looked at the paper. His expression did not change. "Sheriff Crane," Owen said from his position near the wall. His voice was entirely neutral. Morgan glanced at him. "You know the name?" "I know the name. Daniel Crane was the blood-sworn brother of James McCrae. He issued that warrant 8 months after Mrs. Drummond killed the first of the McCrae brothers." Owen paused. "Crane died in 1889, a land dispute outside Miles City. The men who worked with him either retired or transferred. Nobody ever formally revoked that notice." Morgan looked at Owen for a long moment. Then he looked back at the paper. "Nobody revoked it," he said. "No, sir. It's been sitting in the territorial files for 17 years, which is a long time for a piece of paper to sit without anyone looking at it." He smoothed the edge of the notice with his thumb. "Then last week someone in the territorial office was reorganizing the old files and found it. Sent copies to active sheriff's offices and deputies in the region." He looked at Harper, "Including mine." Nobody spoke. "Now," Morgan said, "I want to be very precise about what I know and what I don't know." He straightened up slightly with the bearing of a man delivering testimony to himself. "I know that this notice was issued by a man who was by documented record personally connected to the very family that Mrs. Drummond was alleged to have wronged. I know that the charges on this notice represent actions that by any fair accounting of the facts were taken in response to 10 murders for which no official charges were ever filed." He paused. "I also know that I have no idea whether this notice has any valid legal standing after 17 years and the death of the issuing officer." "You could find out," Harper said carefully. "I could," Morgan agreed. "I could send a wire to the territorial capital and ask a lawyer. That would take a few days." He looked at Harper with the direct steadiness of a man who wants to be very clearly understood. "Or I could note for the record that I arrived at this shop this afternoon and found no evidence of any individual matching the description on this notice, and that in the absence of any such individual, there is nothing to act upon." The clock ticked. "That seems like a reasonable position," Owen said. "It does to me." Morgan reached across the counter and picked up the notice. He folded it once along the original crease. He held it in his hand for a moment looking at it. Then he put it back in his inside pocket. "Harper," he said. "Morgan. You've got a fine shop here. Your father would be pleased with it." "I hope so." "Clean it up before you open tomorrow. That scuff on the floor near the far wall is going to bother customers." He nodded at the room generally. "Gentlemen." He turned and walked to the door. His hand on the handle, he paused without looking back. "There's a woman lives on the east edge of town," he said. "Does alterations and mending. I've been meaning to bring in a coat that needs new buttons." His voice was easy conversational. "Good to know she settled in. Town's better for having steady, quiet people." He walked out. The bell rang. The door closed. The 5 of them stood in the ringing silence that followed. Jessie looked at the door, then at Harper, then at Owen. "Did he just—" "Yes," Harper said. "He knew she was here. He knew. And he just—" "Yes," Harper said again. "He did." Tommy was shaking his head slowly, the movement of someone trying to reorganize what they understood about how the world worked. "Why?" he said. "Why would he do that? She's on a wanted notice." It's his job to keep the peace," Owen said, "which he is doing." He moved to the window, looked out at the street, the ordinary afternoon going on outside. "Clay Morgan has been the law in this county for 19 years. He has seen a great many things in that time. He knows the difference between paperwork and justice. Some men in his position don't. He does." He turned from the window. "And he came here this afternoon to make a decision. He made it." Jessie sat back down on the stool. He looked at the empty glasses on the counter, at the piece of wood, at the folded paper Owen had left. "I feel like I've been awake for 3 days," he said. "You've been awake for 4 hours," Tommy said. "Then why do I feel like it's been 3 days?" Nobody had a good answer for that. Eliza had been gone for 40 minutes before any of them thought to wonder exactly where she had gone. She had left quietly, the way she had done most things that day without announcement or ceremony. She had finished her whiskey set, the glass on the counter, looked at Harper for a moment in a way that covered everything that needed covering and required nothing else, and walked out. The bell had rung. The door had closed. And the shop had felt in her absence briefly like a room where a lamp had been extinguished, not dark, not cold, but aware of a light it no longer had. Owen was the one who looked out the window about 30 minutes after she left and saw at the far end of the street the figure of a woman on a gray horse moving east at a walking pace, not hurrying, not looking back. "She's all right," he said. Harper, who had not asked the question aloud, but had been asking it internally, nodded. She rode east out of town on Birch, and the afternoon was quiet around her, in the way afternoon on the Montana flats is quiet, not empty, but spacious, the kind of silence that has room in it for things to breathe. The road took her out past the edge of the last building on the eastern side, past the corral where 3 horses stood together in the shade of a cottonwood, past the small white marker at the cemetery fence where she kept her eyes forward. The road climbed a low rise and then flattened again, and from the top of the rise, briefly, she could see the whole spread of the valley, the town behind her, small and ordinary against the enormous landscape. And ahead, the long, rolling country that went on for a very long time before it became something different. At the top of the rise, she stopped Birch. Not because she had planned to, just because it felt like the place to stop. She sat there for a while the way you sit in a place when you are not ready to leave it and not sure you want to stay. The light was coming from the west at a low angle now, beginning its long afternoon lean, and it cast the grass in gold and the far ridgeline in purple, and the sky above it was the specific shade of blue that the Montana sky becomes in late afternoon, in the fall, deep and clean, a blue with actual depth to it, a blue you could fall into if you let yourself. Samuel had loved this sky. He used to stop whatever he was doing anywhere they were and just look at it when it got that color. She had teased him about it once, said he spent more time looking up than working. He had laughed and said that a man who didn't look up occasionally forgot what he was working for. She had not looked up in a long time. She looked up now. The sky held. Blue deepened toward the ridges where the light was leaving. A single hawk turned in a wide, unhurried circle over the eastern grassland, working the thermals. Far off in the direction of town, she could hear or imagined she could hear the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday afternoon. People finishing up their business. Horses being brought in. Children running somewhere with the specific urgency of children who have been told supper is almost ready. Ordinary sounds. Unremarkable. The kind you forget by the following Tuesday. She had been forgetting them for 14 years. She let her hand rest on the saddle horn and turned her face into the low western light and closed her eyes for a moment. Behind her eyelids the light was warm and even. She could feel the heat of it on her face, the scar and the unmarked skin both equally without distinction. She thought about Colton McCrae. She thought about the photograph in his breast pocket. The woman named Mary in Colorado who had been right about everything and was owed an apology that might or might not be welcome. She thought about a man working as a clerk in a land office in Cheyenne 3 weeks ago who had looked up from a ledger and seen her standing across the counter and who had known her immediately. She had watched the recognition move through him, not fear something more complicated than fear. A complex rearrangement of everything he had been holding for 2 years in the space of a few seconds. He had moved faster than she'd expected. She granted him that. She touched the scar along her jaw. The skin there had finished with hurting months ago. It was just a line now like a seam in old cloth, something that marked where a repair had been made. She thought about what she had said to him in that shop, about small things, ordinary things, feeding the horse, making a meal, talking to someone without calculating what they knew. Doing it badly at first because you'd been something else for so long that ordinary felt foreign. She had said it as advice. She was only now sitting on this rise in the afternoon light, understanding that it was also instruction to herself. The cabin was small and sat at the far eastern edge of town where the last of the built streets gave way to open land. She had lived there for 3 years under a name that was not her name, doing work that was quiet and useful and required no explanation. People brought her things to mend. She mended them. She was good at it, partly because she was careful with her hands by nature, and partly because after years of maintaining firearms in the field, the precise work of needle and thread was not so different in its demands. People in the town knew her as a widow, which was true. They did not know which widow or what the widowhood had cost her or what the 14 years between Samuel's death and her arrival in this town had contained. They knew her as Mrs. Marsh, quiet and reliable, who always had your coat ready when she said she would and charged fair prices and kept her own counsel. She walked Birch into the corral and unsaddled her and gave her water and a section of apple cut into pieces one at a time. Birch ate with the focused contentment of a horse who has had a long day and is glad to be home. "You didn't have to wait," Eliza told her. "I know it felt long." Birch looked at her with the flat, warm patience of horses. Eliza scratched the spot behind her ear that she liked and stood there in the corral for a few minutes, just being in the quiet. The sun was dropping behind the western hills. The light was going orange and low. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark ran through its whole song once and then stopped. She went inside. The cabin was one room with a sleeping area at the back, a wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, a chest for her things, and a shelf on the wall beside the door where she kept her few books. The windows were small, and the light inside was always a little dimmer than outside, which she had come to like. It felt private without being closed. On the wall across from the stove level with her eye when she sat at the table, there was a photograph in a plain wooden frame. A man and a woman, both young, standing in front of a half-built structure, barely more than a foundation, and the first courses of timber. The man was laughing at something outside the frame. The woman was looking at the camera with the expression of someone trying to be serious for the photograph, but finding it difficult because the person beside her was laughing. She hung her coat on the peg by the door, set her hat on the shelf. Then she went to the stove and put the kettle on and sat at the table to wait for it. She looked at the photograph. For most of the past 14 years, looking at it had produced a specific sensation, a pressure behind the sternum, a tightening in the throat, and beneath both of those the particular guilt of someone who has chosen to do something that the person in the photograph would not have wanted and cannot ask forgiveness for it. Tonight the sensation was different. She looked at Samuel's face, mid-laugh, head tilted, that expression he wore when something had caught him fully by surprise and delighted him, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She just missed him. Plainly, simply, without complication. The clean ache of someone who has lost something they loved without the layers of anger and purpose and violence that had been laid over it for so long. Just missing him. She sat with it. Let it be what it was without trying to do anything about it. The kettle began to talk quietly on the stove. "I kept the promise," she said to the photograph. Her voice in the empty room was her own voice, not the flat, measured voice she had used in the shop, not the careful voice of 14 years of being on guard. Just her voice. All 6 of them. I found them all. She paused. And then a 7th one came and I didn't kill him. She looked at Samuel's face. "I think you would have liked that part," she said. The kettle came to a boil. She got up and made her tea. Owen Fletcher left town the following morning early before the shops opened. He stopped at the post office first, where he sent a brief wire to an address in Denver. Then he walked to the livery, collected his horse, and rode south toward the flats. He had done what he came to do. He had been an old man in a gun shop who'd happened to be in the right place, and he had been a cavalry scout reading a room, and he had been a man carrying 20 years of a specific guilt, and had finally, in a room full of people on the edge of something terrible, said the true thing aloud, and found that saying it did not destroy him. He had also been a witness. That was perhaps the most important thing, not the gun at his belt, or the positioning along the back wall, or any of the tactical preparations he'd made without thinking out of habit, but the simple fact of having been present and paying attention. He had told Harper he intended to tell this story someday. He meant it. Not as a tale of heroism, there were enough of those, and most of them were half invention anyway. As a true account of a Tuesday morning in a small town when 5 ordinary people and 1 extraordinary woman and 1 man full of grief stood in a room together and chose all of them to be something other than what the moment seemed to demand. He rode south through the early light, turning it over in his mind, finding the shape of it, the details that mattered and the ones that didn't. He thought about the piece of wood on Harper's counter. He thought about the photograph in Colton McRae's breast pocket. He thought about Eliza's hands on the worn grip of the Colt, working the leather along it the way you tend something you are preparing to release. He thought about Jesse Crane's face when he finally really looked at her, the particular expression of a young man encountering evidence that the world is larger and stranger and more demanding than he has been treating it. That expression was worth preserving. Not because it was remarkable, it was in truth a very common expression worn by every person at some point in their lives when they encounter something that requires them to grow, but because it was real. It was a face at the moment of actual change, which is always worth remembering. He thought about what Eliza had said toward the end. You start with small things, ordinary things. You do it badly at first because you've been something else for so long that ordinary feels like a foreign language. And then slowly, if you're patient with yourself, it starts to feel like coming home to a place you'd almost forgotten existed. He thought about that for a long time riding south in the early light. He was 62 years old. He had been a cavalry scout and a soldier, and a man carrying a private accounting of what he had not done in a mountain pass in 1879. He had been most of his adult life the kind of man who read rooms for danger and slept facing the door. He thought maybe the foreign language is worth learning. He rode on. Jesse Crane locked up the shop that evening at 6, which was the usual time. He swept the floor. The scuff marks near the far wall came up with some effort and wiped down the counters and covered the display cases with their cloths and turned off the lamps one by one. Before he left, he stood for a minute in the quiet of the closed shop. The piece of wood was still on the counter. Harper had left it there when he locked up his own office in back, and Jesse supposed it would stay there until Harper decided what to do with it, or until it became simply part of the furniture of the place, one of those objects that accumulates in a shop over years, whose origin is known to the owner and becomes a mystery to everyone who comes after. He looked at the drawer beneath the register, the empty one with the red velvet. He thought about what Harper had said, about the colt being there when she needed it. He thought about Tommy's voice earlier that afternoon, quiet wondering. I think she's saying goodbye to it. He thought about himself this morning, leaning on the counter with a grin that had worked before and saying, "Look what the wind blew into a woman he knew nothing about." He stood there with that thought for a while. Let it be uncomfortable. It was supposed to be uncomfortable. The discomfort was the point that was where the change happened, in the space where you made yourself look at what you'd done and didn't let yourself look away too quickly. He was 26 years old. He had a long time ahead of him if the world cooperated. Long enough to do a great deal of things. Long enough to practice being different than he'd been this morning. He turned off the last lamp, walked to the door, paused, went back to the counter, opened the drawer and looked at the red velvet for a moment. Then he closed the drawer gently, the way you close something that deserves care. He walked out, locked the door behind him. The bell rang once in the dark interior of the closed shop. In the weeks that followed, the town went on the way towns do, absorbing events, smoothing them into the texture of daily life, covering them with the ordinary business of getting through each day. The crack in Harper's window got repaired. The scuff on the floor faded. The 5 whiskey glasses went back to their shelf. But things were different the way things are always different after something real has happened in a place, even when the surface looks the same. Jesse was different. Not transformed, not suddenly perfected. He still said the wrong thing, sometimes still led with confidence he hadn't entirely earned. But there was a pause in him now, a half-second of consideration before certain things came out of his mouth where there hadn't been one before. Tommy noticed it. Harper noticed it. Jesse himself noticed it and found it useful. Tommy was different in a quieter way. He had watched a great deal on that Tuesday without saying much, which was not his usual mode, and something in the watching had changed the way he listened to people. He started hearing things he hadn't been hearing before, the things people said alongside what they said, the weight behind ordinary sentences. It was, he would think later, like having a new sense switched on. Uncomfortable at first, increasingly indispensable. Harper put the piece of wheel spoke in a small wooden box and set the box on the shelf above his desk in the back room. He did not explain it to anyone who asked. When pressed, he said only that it was a reminder of what he declined to specify. Some reminders lose their power if you talk about them too much. Eliza Drummond stayed, not because she had nowhere to go, and not because the town was the safest place, and not because of any calculation about risk or exposure or the continued intentions of Deputy Morgan, who had made his position reasonably clear. She stayed because she had lived there for 3 years, and the place had become, without her entirely noticing, a place that had her particular shape worn into it. The neighbors knew her knock. The merchants knew her order. Birch knew the smell of that specific corral. She stayed because for the first time in 14 years, staying felt like a choice rather than a tactical position. She went on mending things. Coats, shirts, curtains, the occasional piece of harness that people brought her because she was careful with her hands and didn't overcharge. She was good at finding where things had come apart and putting them back together in a way that held. People remarked on it sometimes that her repairs were nearly invisible, that you couldn't always find the place where the damage had been. She accepted the compliment without offering the explanation, which was that she had simply spent a very long time looking closely at the places where things broke. Some mornings she sat on the porch of the cabin before the day started and drank her tea and watched the light come up over the eastern hills, not reading the angles, not counting the distances, just watching the light. She thought about Colton sometimes. She did not know what had become of him, whether he had gone to Colorado, whether the woman named Mary had been willing to listen, whether he had managed in whatever way was available to him to build something out of the rubble of the 2 years he had given to grief and preparation and the long, cold discipline of becoming someone capable of doing what he had, in the end, chosen not to do. She hoped he had. She did not know, and she had made her peace with not knowing. Some things you do without the comfort of verification. You say what seems true and necessary to say, and then the person walks out of your story and into their own, and you cannot follow them there, and it is not your place to try. The world is large. There is room for a great many different endings to the same conversation. One evening in late autumn, about 6 weeks after that Tuesday, Eliza was at the table by the window when she heard the sound of someone at her door. She did not reach for anything. She simply turned and looked at the door. A knock. Even. Patient. She opened it. Harper was standing on the step, hat in hand, with the expression of a man who has thought about coming to a particular place for a while and has finally gotten around to it. "Evening," he said. "Evening, Harper. I brought you something." He held out the small wooden box, the one she'd seen on his counter the day she'd come back 3 days after the Tuesday. She took it, opened it. The piece of wheel spoke, dark and worn and smooth. "I've been thinking," Harper said, "about what it represents. And I've been thinking that it might mean different things to different people. To me it meant you can show up and change how a thing goes, even in the worst circumstances, even when nobody asked you." He paused. "But to you it might mean something else. And it's yours as much as it's mine. Maybe more." Eliza looked at the piece of wood in the box. She closed her fingers around it, felt the weight of it, the warmth it had taken on from Harper's coat pocket. "Come in," she said. "I have tea on." He came in. She made 2 cups. They sat at the table and drank their tea in the lamplight and talked not about any of it, not directly, but around it and alongside it, the way you talk when you have been through something together and don't need to keep rehearsing it. About the town, about the season, about a horse Harper was considering buying and wasn't sure about. Outside the night was clear and cold, and the stars were very bright in the way they get in late autumn when the air has cleaned itself and the sky seems closer than usual, more present. After a while Harper said, "Are you all right? Honestly?" Eliza thought about the question the way she thought about most things, straight on, without flinching away from the harder parts of it. "I'm finding out," she said. "I think that's the honest answer. Some mornings I wake up and don't know who I am without the purpose I carried for so long. And some mornings I wake up and it's just a morning and that feels like enough." She paused. "The second kind is getting more frequent." Harper nodded. That seemed to him like the right kind of answer. He left an hour later, walking back toward town through the cold night. He did not hurry. The stars were bright and the road was clear, and there was no particular reason to rush. Eliza stood on the porch and watched him go until the dark took him. Then she went inside. She set the small wooden box on the shelf beside the photograph, stood back and looked at both of them for a moment, the box and the 2 people in the frame, the man laughing at something outside the picture and the woman trying not to laugh with him. She turned off the lamp. In the dark, she found her way to the bed by memory, which is how you find your way in a place you know well enough to have memorized it without meaning to. Outside, the night was large and still. The stars burned on without any interest in human business. The town at the end of the road was quiet. The shop was locked and dark. The drawer beneath the counter held its piece of red velvet and nothing else. And on a shelf in a small cabin at the edge of the Montana flats, beside a photograph of 2 young people standing in front of something they were building together, A small piece of dark wood sat in a plain wooden box. Proof that someone had shown up. Proof that one person at exactly the right moment had looked at a bad situation and known what to do. Proof that the West, which takes so much, sometimes gives something back. Nobody died in Harper's gun shop that Tuesday. And if you ask people who were there if you could ask them now, all these years later, they would tell you that was the strangest and most important part of the whole story. Not the 6 men who died before, not the long chase across 3 territories, not the scar or the gun or the man in black who rode in at noon and rode out an hour later going the other direction. The strangest and most important part was the silence after the door closed. The 5 people standing in a room where something enormous had almost happened and hadn't. The whiskey poured into 5 glasses, the piece of old wood on the counter, the empty drawer waiting. The West was a hard country. It asked hard things of the people who lived in it, and it was not always careful about who it asked them of or whether those people had any choice in the matter. But some days, not many, but some it gave the choice back. And on those days, a few people in a small shop on a quiet street in Montana chose mercy when violence was available, and rest when the fight was finished, and ordinary life when the extraordinary had been survived. That is the legend of Eliza Drummond. Not what she carried, what she finally put down.